Opening the center immediately, this pawn leap establishes a dynamic presence and prepares for swift piece development. Preparing a flexible pawn structure, black chooses a path that, while solid, cedes some central space initially. Opening up a diagonal for the queen's bishop while subtly contesting central space. Striking the center, black immediately challenges white's modest pawn setup and opens lines for queenside development. A reserved development, preparing to support the d-pawn's advance without immediately contesting the center's tense pawn structure. Developing knights into the center often creates immediate tactical opportunities and a strong piece presence. Shielding the king and preparing development, white subtly reinforces the central pawn structure for the upcoming skirmish. Challenging white's central pawn structure, black aims to open lines and seize space on the queenside. Stepping back, white prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming for long-range influence on the dark squares and potentially creating a more resilient pawn structure. Developing knights to active squares is paramount, reinforcing central control and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal solidifies the kingside and prepares for castling, while maintaining flexibility for the central pawn structure. Completing development naturally, preparing to castle and solidify the kingside. Securing the monarch's safety becomes paramount now, paving the way for central engagement. Securing the king with castling is a standard defensive maneuver, establishing a safe harbor before engaging in central skirmishes. This maneuver prepares for pawn advances, potentially opening lines while keeping the king shielded. Securing the b-file, this rook is poised to contest an important open avenue. Pushing the pawn forward creates immediate central space, potentially cramping black's knight. Nurturing the knight's mobility away from the pawn chain frees up options for future pawn advances. A subtle repositioning, aiming to bolster the kingside defense and potentially facilitate a kingside pawn storm later. Expanding on the queenside, black prepares to challenge white's central control and potentially open lines for their pieces. Initiating a queenside pawn storm is a bold attempt to disrupt black's solid structure and open lines against the castled king. This bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's queenside buildup and potentially eye the c4 square. Shifting the knight to h2 is a curious defensive maneuver, potentially aiming to reroute it to a safer square or support a kingside pawn advance. Aggressively expanding on the queenside, this thrust seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure and gain valuable territory. Liberating the bishop from its fianchettoed post, white eyes the queenside and prepares to challenge black's expansive pawn structure with a well-placed attacker. Boldly challenging white's central pawn push, this maneuver aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and activate the light-squared bishop. Redirecting pressure towards black's queenside pawn chain, the bishop subtly prepares to contest the vital dark squares. Breaching the pawn chain like this instantly sharpens the battle, creating tactical possibilities across the board by opening lines. Challenging black's pawn chain, white opens lines for his bishops and aims to break the queenside encirclement. Challenging the central pawn structure now, this queen placement seeks to open lines and create opportunities on the queenside by pressuring d4. Bolstering the queen's bishop, this aims to stabilize the queenside and prepare a central pawn push. Unleashing the rook into the heart of white's position, black intensifies the queenside pressure and prepares to contest the crucial c-file. Initiating an aggressive kingside pawn storm, white aims to disrupt black's development and exploit the temporarily exposed monarch. Shifting the knight to f8 opens lines for the queen and prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm. Unleashing a pawn chain, white seeks to fracture black's queenside structure, creating potential weaknesses for future exploitation. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure with nd sacrifices tempo but shores up a potential weakness. Unleashing pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to shatter black's defenses and open lines against the uncastled monarch. Shattering the pawn chain opens lines, but exposes your king to the advancing knights. The bishop reclaims its influence, challenging black's queenside initiative and preparing to exploit the weakened central squares. A daring regrouping effort, aiming to disrupt white's central control and redeploy the knight to a more active square. Focusing the queen on the kingside, white initiates a potential kingside assault, aiming to exploit black's somewhat cramped position. Swapping this knight fundamentally alters the pawn structure, potentially opening lines or creating weaknesses for black's king. Opening the h-file grants your king breathing room and creates potent attacking avenues. Consolidating defense, the rook anchors the d-file, a vital artery for future operations or potential counterattacks. Steering the knight toward the queenside offers attacking potential, but watch for potential weaknesses around your king if the center opens too quickly. A proactive rerouting of the knight, aiming to stabilize the d5 square and potentially reinforce the queenside if given time. Securing the monarch initiates a positional realignment, preparing for further pawn advances. Solidifying the bishop's diagonal and preparing a central pawn push. Sacrificing the bishop simplifies the position, opening lines for the rook and creating pawn weaknesses for black. Reclaiming the d-file, black repositions a rook to a more active post, challenging white's central pawn structure. Securing the h-file with the rook intends to pressure black's castled king. Black seeks to activate the queen by preparing a potential exchange, aiming to simplify into an endgame where their knight on d7 can become more influential. Sharpening the attack down the open file, this rook insertion threatens to unravel black's queenside structure. A daring repositioning, the rook ventures forward, seeking to disrupt white's central control and open new attacking avenues. Reinforcing the central pawn chain with the rook solidifies white's queenside ambitions and restricts black's counterplay. The knight retreats to defend the pawn structure, a necessary but passive repositioning. A thunderbolt from the knight, forcing the black king into a precarious, exposed position. Sacrificing a pawn to expose your king is a desperate measure, opening lines for a swift counterattack. Obliterating the pawn wall offers a direct assault, exposing black's monarch to immediate danger. Unpinning the bishop opens up the queen to attack the weakened kingside. Removing the pawn frees the f-file, unleashing powerful attacking potential against black's weakened king position. The queen's sortie to e4 offers a surprising defense, threatening mate and opening the floodgates for counterplay. Exchanging queens now simplifies, leading to a potentially advantageous endgame for white due to the open g-file. Accepting the pawn's sacrifice immediately simplifies the structure, creating an open file for your rook and a potentially awkward passed pawn for white. Unleashing the rook creates immediate pressure, threatening a forced sequence that could dismantle black's defensive structure. King's safety is paramount, so neutralizing that immediate check is the only sensible option to prevent further chaos. Opening the c-file now offers white a clear path to exploit black's weakened queenside and launch an attack. Recapturing the pawn directly plunges into a tactical melee, potentially simplifying into an endgame where white's exposed king might become a liability. Unleashing the rook along the open 8th rank to decimate black's defenses. Re-establishing the knight's defensive postion on f8 is crucial to preventing further king endangerment. This repositioning of the rook aims to contest the open file and potentially create mating threats against black's exposed king. Safeguarding the monarch from immediate checks becomes paramount, as the opposing rook now occupies a more menacing position. Capturing the rook on e4 seizes open the file, immediately threatening the king's safety and creating immediate tactical opportunities. Shifting pressure to the queenside, this attempt to break white's grip on the c-file seems a touch optimistic given the exposed king. Initiating a decisive exchange to seize open lines and exploit the exposed enemy monarch. Reasserting pressure on the open c-file, the rook infiltrates, aiming to disrupt white's already fractured queenside. Pawn advances seize territory, potentially strangling black's piece mobility and opening attacking lanes. Seizing the file offers immediate activity, but exposes your king to further pressure along the open lines. Recapturing the pawn immediately tightens white's grip on the queen's side, forcing black to defend the now vulnerable rook. A bold recapture, aiming to exploit the open file and attack the white king's defense. Unleashing the bishop to disrupt the rook's defensive work, forcing a difficult response.